Hi there, it's John from Tutor to You. Welcome to the Economics Teachers Staffroom. In each episode we're going to consider a major topic facing economics teachers. We're going to ask our panel of experienced practitioners to give their advice and suggestions. Here we're going to discuss understanding how economics exams are written. Let's meet the panel.
I'm Penny Brooks. I'm now retired from school teaching. I've taught in the past in schools in both the independent and the state sector. I've been a head of economics. I've done a bit of economics examining for both AQA and for Edexcel exam boards, and I tutor students in both years 12 and 13.
Hi, I'm Nicky King. I've been teaching economics A-level for nearly 3 decades. I've taught Edexcel, AQA, OCR, IB and International A-level, and have examined A-levels for more years than I care to mention. I've been working with Tutor to You, creating student resources and delivering teacher CPD for more than 20 years now.
Hi, I'm George Vlachonikolis. I'm a teacher of economics and have been for about 12 years now. I teach at Headington Rise School, which is an all-girls independent school in Oxford.
Hello, I'm Lisa Newton. I'm head of economics at an independent day school and boarding school in London. In addition, I'm a team leader on Edexcel, and I was leading a team on paper 2 this year.
Why is it important for teachers and students of economics to understand how the exams are written and designed?
Yeah, I think there's a really simple answer to this question, which is that because the exam results will be the ultimate judgment of your students and your own performance at the end of the academic year. We can all debate the rights and wrongs of that process, but it is what it is. And ultimately, your students will judge their performance, their parents will judge their performance and your performance, and probably your senior leaders within your school will judge your performance based on those exam results. So I like to think about it in terms of analogies with people like an Olympic 100-meter runner. He or she has spent years preparing for one moment. It's a 10-second moment in which their performance in that moment will be judged for a long time after. And that's what it is similarly with summer A-level exams. And if that is the case, then why wouldn't you want to maximize your potential for success by really trying to understand everything about that final race or that final test that you'll be involved in? And I just think this is attention to detail at the last hurdle. You know, what is it? What are the questions going to look like? How will the questions be marked? What will the format of the exam be? What's the rubric? How many? How long is it? How long should I spend on an essay? I mean, there's all of this is just attention to detail, and understanding it, as I say, is likely to maximize your chances of success later on.
I'm coming at this from the perspective of having written some exam style materials and questions for Tutor to You. So I think, or my sense is that teachers and students of economics should understand what the examiner is looking for. So why have they asked that question? What do they want the student to show? What's sort of in the head of the examiner when they were wording a question? Secondly, I think to get a pattern for the skills that are being tested in each type of question, so that they have, again, I suppose it's a case of trying to get into the head of the examiner and think about what are they looking for in the answer in terms of the balance between knowledge, application, analysis, and evaluation. And then also finally to be aware of how questions are designed to cover a range of topics in a paper, a range from the specification. So getting ideas of how to make links between different topics on the specification.
Well, the most important thing is that if teachers understand how a question is written or designed, then they teach much more effectively. And when they teach more effectively, then students feel more confident in their teacher and more confident and are much more willing to listen and to try out exactly what their teachers are suggesting. Hundreds of years worth of experience has gone into exam question writing, and it has been perfected and perfected and perfected. And they really are as good as they can be. So we have to trust in the system. Over the years, I've written thousands of exam questions, and I've written questions on the board just off the cuff, and they've been an utter disaster. Or I've written it for a mock exam, and they've been a disaster because I haven't actually understood how the exam questions should be asked and what needs to go in, what the thought processes are, and then how they can be interpreted.
I think the most important reason for trying to drill down and get a sense of what the exams are requiring is to ensure that your pupils' skills and knowledge and understanding and hard work are rewarded when results come in August. I think the key point I would make about looking at the exams and working out what's required is very often the most obvious points are the ones that will get rewarded. There are no marks in this for creativity or coming up with the most obscure angle on a question. The key thing is to answer the question that's in front of you. So, for example, if you were talking about something like assess the impact of rising inflation, you would be wanting to talk about the impact on consumers and on their purchasing power and on their standard of living. And then the evaluation of that might be to discuss, well, what's the extent of the rise in inflation? Would it affect everybody equally? So those are the sort of areas you need to think about when you're looking at the questions that are being set. Always think about, well, what's the most obvious logical response? I've increasingly suggested to my pupils that when you do an exam question, look at the mark scheme. The mark scheme for, let's say, an essay will normally have under it 6 or 8 bullet points of possible points that could be made. I tend to say to all my pupils, the first 4 or 5 are the obvious points, okay? Because they're the ones when the examiners sat in a room and started devising the mark schemes, they will be the ones that they came up with first. They will be the most obvious ones. But generally speaking, it's a really good tip when you are doing exam practice or question practice. If you look at the bullet points on the mark schemes, the first few are usually the most obvious ones. So I always say to my pupils, well, they're the ones you really need to be hitting. So I think that's a really important angle. I always call those first few bullet points the big hitters and say to my students, if you aren't hitting 1 or 2 of those, that's going to be concerning. So training them to realise what an examiner's looking for when they ask a question. There are some really obvious points for almost every scenario. So it's very important to try and think about that. Another thing I would say is that there is no question that the best CPD for your economics department is somebody being an examiner. 4 out of 5 of my department do it. 2 of us are team leaders. It is not worth the money and it is painful. But if you can persuade someone in your department to do it, maybe you can cut them some slack somewhere, lighten their load in some way to make it worth their while. The benefits you get as an examiner are so significant, it's really worth trying to facilitate someone in your department to do that in order to get a little bit of inside track on the process. I think it's also important to remember that the questions are designed to be discriminating. So that's a really important point to bear in mind.
What's the underlying process at awarding bodies for setting exams?
So I think the underlying process, or at least the underlying idea behind any good assessment organisation like an exam board, is to make sure that when you're setting an exam or a series of questions that make up an exam, that you are eliciting, you are gathering the right sort of information or a suitable information that allows you to make a valid judgment or inference about that particular candidate's ability. So let me just walk it back a little bit. Sometime 10 years ago, and it is about 10 years ago now that these specifications had been written, there would have been a team within the exam board that really thought quite deeply, one hopes, about what it is they want from a young 18-year-old economist. What makes up a good 18-year-old economist in terms of underlying knowledge, skills, behaviours. And they put that together, and we can call that the construct. And then the whole idea then about setting an exam is to set an artifact, an assessment artifact that will allow students to, like I say, demonstrate their ability against that construct. So when you're designing an exam, you really have to think carefully about the questions that you're setting. Are these construct relevant? Are these really testing those things that we think make for a good economist? Are we being fair? Are we being unfair? Am I asking questions about a market, for example, that is likely to be, that one section of students is likely to have far more information about than another? That would be an example of an unfair question. We need to make sure that we ask fair questions. We need to make sure that we ask questions that will give us suitable information about that candidate's level of ability, so that we can confidently stick a judgment on that and say that this is an economist at, various level of ability. Is it an A-star economist, an A-grade economist, a B-grade economist, and so forth?
The questions need to provide scope to discriminate between a top-level answer and a poor answer. So levels of response marking, which are used on Edexcel for any question of 10 marks and above, are really designed to be able to reward all sorts of answers, from the best to answers that have just, maybe shown some isolated pieces of knowledge and application. So that's the purpose, to set an exam that's discriminating and challenging, and will also ensure that the right number of A stars are delivered. The exams are norm referenced, not criterion referenced, and therefore we are aware that Ofqual need exams to deliver roughly the same percentage of A stars. So the boundary for an A star will move on the basis of that, not necessarily content. So, for example, last year, the A star boundary for Edexcel went up 3 or 4 marks from the previous year, because the paper was deemed to be more accessible, more straightforward. So I think it's important to bear those things in mind. If a paper is deemed to be relatively easy, and therefore the A-star boundary is going to rise, it's going to be even more important that your candidates don't lose the easy marks. So, for example, on short answer questions that require application, you really need to make sure your pupils aren't dropping marks needlessly, because any mark lost is clearly going to impact on a boundary. It's quite possible to get full marks on short answer questions and on data response questions that are 5 and 8 mark. Highly unlikely that you will get full marks on an essay, although I did hand out quite a lot of 25 marks on the essay on paper 2 Edexcel this year.
Well, first and foremost, they have to align with the specification. In years gone by, and I'm talking a long time ago when things were not quite so tight exam boards, you might get a question on something that wasn't quite in the specification, and oh my word, all us teachers would write in and, oh, that's not fair, that's not fair. So first and foremost, they have to align with the specification. There has to be some kind of topic balance, so we can't have overlapping questions where a similar question is asked but from a slightly different angle at a later point in the exam paper. We need accessibility and fairness. If you're writing for something important like a mock paper, you must have a go at the question yourself, or get a colleague to have a go at the question themselves.
What do examiners think about when setting questions?
Okay, so I think the first thing maybe is to make sure that they've got a reasonable coverage of topics in the specification. And it's probably worth sounding a note of caution here. You know, if we look back at what topics have been examined and when, just because something has had lots of questions asked about it in the past, doesn't mean to say that they're not thinking about asking questions on the same topic again. Because A, it's one of the key topics, and B, it might be a topic that they found that students haven't dealt with very well in the past, and therefore they want to set questions on it again. And I think that, and that's something you pick up sometimes from those examiners' reports, that they are noting the topics which students ought to be dealing with better, perhaps, and so they're giving an opportunity for that for the future. I tend to start with, when I've been writing stuff for Tutor to You, with an idea of the knowledge that I want the answer to demonstrate. So start with an idea for a question. I'll then, having got that roughly down on paper, I then have found that writing the mark scheme next, and then going back to the question to refine it seems to work best, because the question may actually end up rather different to what I first thought of. So I think that's where examiners, I'm assuming that their probably experience takes them in the same direction, that the mark scheme defines how they want to ask the question. And then if you put that specifically into the realm of the data response questions, they would then, and I certainly have, gone back to the stimulus material that I've used to sort of bring about the question and then the answer, and made sure that it has got helpful clues, that it has got the information which I think is going to be helpful, is going to be relevant for the students to use, and exclude things that which are red herrings and which they shouldn't use. And I think that's probably the same with the sort of essays that have got the very brief STEM information, that, again, making sure that is relevant. And I suspect examiners do that in much the same way.
They need to avoid overlap in different areas, the repetition between the questions and overlap of perhaps topics. They also need to think about, how are students going to respond? Are we actually testing something useful here? And in that test, have we got an ability to differentiate? And also, how easy or how complex is this going to be to mark this? Is the topic, is there application there? Is the topic appropriate to a 16, 17, 18-year-old? Is it a market they might have heard of? D, is it discriminating, differentiating? Am I going to be able to tell the difference between the students that work really hard and those that perhaps have got a little bit more work to do? Early on, when I was writing exam questions, and I'm sure that examiners have to think about this too, that if it's too prescriptive, then you just might not be rewarding what is actually good economics, because it isn't on the mark scheme. If it's good economics, it should be rewarded. So we need some flexibility in there, but not so woolly that our colleagues can't understand it and it can't be applied consistently.
Well, they're thinking about all sorts of things, but the underlying thing that they should be thinking about is whether or not this is a good, valid assessment of all of the understanding, skills, behaviors that we essentially have set out in the specification of, what makes a good young economist. So You've got to think about your question in terms of being fair to all the students, making sure that it will elicit the sort of information that you want it to elicit. You've got to make sure that it tests the entire range of content within the A level, or at least a significant portion of the specification. And you've got to make sure that it fits all of the different AOs that are outlined in the specification as well. So that's somewhere at the front of any exam board specification. How much knowledge will be tested, how much application will be tested, and how much analysis will be tested, and how much evaluation will be tested. And so all of this eventually has to come together in the final thing. But let's be clear about this. I mean, whilst it might be one single person who has the initial responsibility to come up with questions, there is a team around that person who is supporting them and making sure that all those individual elements are being thought about and coming together by the end to make sure that this is the fairest and most valid test that can possibly have been set ready for the summer.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Economics Teachers Staff Room.